All right, let's see, how does this work? Right, just to start off with, basically, one of the points I want to get across is that humans and ecosystems are intrinsically linked. We don't sit outside them. Sometimes we like to think we do, but we don't. And the whole history of human development, civilizations, urban centers is almost symbiotic with natural ecosystems. And so the dawn of civilizations, these first early river sort of civilizations that sprang up across the world in places like this, the Yellow River, there's a huge interdependency, and the prosperity of those early centers of civilization really went hand in hand with the dependency on the natural systems. And sometimes we lose sight of that. We lose sight of that too easily. What I really want to talk about, though, is ecosystem services. And these are terms that get used very, very loosely nowadays. They appear in many publications, but sometimes people have to think about what they actually are. And there's many definitions, such as the benefits that human populations derive directly or indirectly, the capacity of natural processes and compounds to provide goods and services that satisfy human needs, a set of ecosystem functions that are useful for humans, the benefits people obtain from ecosystems, collective term for goods and services, a whole range of definitions out there. Most of these came out from work that was undertaken in the mid-1990s. But for my sins, I've been involved in this sort of work for getting on to 20 years. In the 1970s in the United States, people like Joe Larson were producing guidance documents on how to identify the functions and values of wetlands. This isn't new. This has been around for decades. Only really since the real kickstart that came in the late 90s, and especially with the Millennium ecosystem assessment in 2005, that it really started building a momentum. But these aren't new things. These concepts have been around for 20, 30 years. Despite the multitude of definitions that people always wrestle in academic circles to get their definitions to be the definition, I think it's worth just looking at some of the language. The first one, Bob Costanza's definition, had ecosystem service equaling benefit. Some of them have ecosystem services that deliver benefits, and these go through all of them. So there isn't a consistency even amongst the definitions. Now that might seem like a rather loose technical point, but it has real issue when you're trying to translate these things into something as a policy or as a decision maker. Within these many definitions, there are commonalities though, and it's worth thinking about what makes them, what's common to all of them. One of the things is that there's an association with human benefits, that human society, from individuals to complex societies, we benefit from ecosystem services and from the ecosystems. And these also encompass both human and environmental elements. So you can't disconnect the two. I think this is where I get interested, is that I think consideration of ecosystem services, and a lot of other authors out there think the same way, that it gives us a way to augment, to improve and increase the current mechanisms for preserving and protecting ecosystems. And basically what it does is it takes it away from an ethical dimension, where we're saying, the picture of the panda earlier on, pandas are good, we have a moral and ethical obligation to that panda, to actually say, there's a lot of people that really, let's be honest, do not give a damn about that panda, whether it lives or dies, as long as their kids have got the cuddly toy. What they do care about is they care about money, and they care about economics. And I think it gives us an opportunity to get an economic dimension to things, and that puts us in different discussion forums and makes different arguments available to us. So it does integrate the ethical with the economic. I alluded to the work of the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. This was, I think, was quite a seminal moment, and if you plot, there's some papers that actually plotted the number of publications. There was one which came out in looking at both publications about geography, but also overall. And around about 2005, the curve just takes off, where a lot of people followed up the work of the ecosystem assessment and recognised that this is something that's got real traction, and it was picked up by a lot of the multilateral environmental agreements, and it was picked up by a lot of nation states. And one of the things that the MA did was it split services into different categories. And I'm going to come on to the categories in a minute, but again, there's many different ways to cut this up. Many different authors have come up with ways of looking at it. One of the things that's worth bearing in mind, though, if you're going to start trying to look at this from an economic perspective, is the whole issue of double counting. Is the MA came up with these categories. And interestingly, they have this thing called supporting services, which support all the other services. So are there actually any other services, or are there just supporting services? Again, it might seem a minor point, but if you're going to try and put this into an economic dimension, you might end up double counting a lot of these services. And when you look at cost-benefit analysis, that can be a real issue. But for the purpose of this discussion and some work that I'm going to be reporting on, we'll just have those 4 categories: provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. I'm not going to go through all of these, but just to give you an idea, provisioning is basically, from what it says, it's providing benefits to humans, so food, fresh water, products, genetic materials. Regulating services regulate hydrological regimes, erosion, pollution, disease, hazard reduction, but also one that I will flag up, because I'll come back to it, pollination. Cultural services, many different cultural services, recreational, tourism services, spiritual, inspirational, educational services. And this is just to say I practice what I preach. Those 2 children, 2 girls are my children, and they get dragged around wetlands, so they learn about the importance of them. And that's demonstrating I do occasionally do field work and don't just swan around the world going to meetings. That's right, entertainment, it is. And then there's supporting services. Now, biodiversity under the MA construct is seen as a supporting service. I would say biodiversity actually underpins all of this. And soil formation and nutrient cycling are seen as 2 supporting services. Now, what I've put up here is, this little chap is that it's a water vole. It's a very iconic species in the UK, huge decreases in population. It's very cute, it's very cuddly, it's the sort of thing, it's a charismatic species that people love. Conservation organisations in the UK are falling over themselves to get this on their t-shirts and on their merchandising, because it's cute. This frog on a lily pad, that evokes so many sort of cultural images of Disney films. But that's what I'm interested in, this sort of stuff, this muddy brown stuff, that soil, that most people don't even take into account. But that's where your nutrient cycling goes on, that's when your carbon sequestration goes on, that's where a whole load of other things happen. And actually, what you end up with is what really is important are these sort of things. These are bacteria. These are the things that convert ammonia, which is, most of us know, is pretty bad news in the environment, into other nitrogen compounds, into nitrates and into nitrites that can then be denitrified and lost from the system. These are things called mycorrhiza. These are the fungus, symbiotic fungi on the plants, on the roots of plants, that allow plants to take up carbohydrates. And they're also important in cycling of phosphorus. That's biodiversity. That's biodiversity. It's not cute and it's not cuddly, but it's still biodiversity. And I think quite often we talk about biodiversity when we actually mean iconic, charismatic, threatened species. We don't talk about biodiversity in a functional way. That it is the biodiversity, it's the microbes, it's the fungi, it's the nematodes, the worms, it's the invertebrates, it's the butterflies that go from site to site pollinating things. Now, people like to look at butterflies. I was intrigued by Richard's presentation. The second most important habitat for butterflies in Düsseldorf was wasteland. How many cities or how many governments have ever set up a biodiversity action plan for wasteland? Yet what is doing the majority of the pollination? I'd gamble it's those butterflies. Very important for biodiversity. So we need to understand these links between the ecological processes, which is biodiversity is driving, but be that the cute cuddly panda or be that a nematode worm or a bit of bacteria, and how that links in with ecosystem functioning, how these ecosystems work, and again, how if you've got a fragmented system, how's that going to work? How are the ecological processes going to be changed? Because to understand this is fundamental to understanding human well-being. So there's a whole load of models and sort of schematics out there which basically go from ecological process to human well-being. This is just one which is adapted from a couple of authors, where you look at the biophysical structure, you look at the processes. So what are the processes? Net primary productivity, photosynthesis, these basic building blocks, and how they affect the function of ecosystems. And it's that understanding of the process, the interaction between the structure, between the water, the soil, the geomorphology, the hydrology, how that then delivers a service which we as society actually benefit from and helps deliver some sort of human well-being. And that takes you from an ecological context and a biodiversity context into this social context. And it is a continuum. You can't disconnect the two, because things that we do here, as we've just seen, affect that. And so if we're making choices as a society, we affect the very thing we're making a choice about, which then has a feedback in terms of well-being. Again, this picks up a point, again, which Richard made earlier on. This is the whole idea that we're looking at trade-offs quite often. And what you might have is a system where you've got good ecological character. I do a lot of work for the Ramsar Convention on Wetlands, and they talk about wetlands having good ecological character. And so you can go from good ecological character, which means all your bits and pieces are in there, all your animals, all your plants are in there, everything's working in a way that it should be, to a degraded ecological character. But you can also go from human well-being to human ill-being. And basically what you really want to be is you want to be up there. You want to be maintaining that good ecological character to maintain human well-being. Sometimes you have to enter up into these zones where you trade off. You have to think about, well, if you're going to have an action, if you're going to build a road, because we have to link two different centres of population, how do we actually deal with these trade-offs? And it might be what you've got to do is a little bit radical. And we saw some of the suggestions this morning about transport networks, which I don't think are radical if you start looking at it in the context of whether you're degrading ecological character or degrading human well-being. Maybe they're actually not radical, they're what we should be doing. But we don't look at it in the big picture, we look at it in the small picture. And there might be certain things that you go down here that you just shouldn't do, but still, we do a lot of things down here. So we really need to understand what do we mean by ecological processes, and we need to understand what is biodiversity, and sometimes it means just slightly changing the way we use these terms. But if we can't get out of the norm of biodiversity being just about the charismatic and the iconic, even though it's these other things that do the majority of the work for ecosystem services, we also struggle to understand ecological character, ecological process. And again, it was very interesting looking at the discussions earlier on about fragmentation. It was great that people are already recognizing it's not just about size, it's about quality. It's about the function, it's about what's going on in those areas. It's about having corridors which function as corridors, not as isolated bits of habitat, where there's no connectivity of process. So we need to be a little bit smarter about how we deal with ecological process and the consideration of biodiversity. If we can do that, we then might help to recognise benefits. And I'll come back to recognising benefits in a moment, because it's crucial in terms of trying to understand ecosystem services. Because we need to actually put this in the context of fragmentation of process as well as habitat, and fragmentation of ecosystem services and fragmentation of human well-being. These are all part of the same thing. It's taking this idea of splitting the world up, but by doing so, you actually compromise process, you compromise biodiversity per se, and you compromise ecosystem services. But not necessarily all ecosystem services, which I'll come back to.